That's right. Okay. Yeah. Hello, hello, hello. Okay. Good afternoon to all the cultural audience around the world. I hope you are well along with all your loved ones. My name is Luis David Fernandez Zambrano. I'm within the framework of the Chair of the Culture of the Peace and Human Rights of the Faculty of the Social Science of the University of Buenos Aires. We will celebrate the conference Rethinking the End of History, Insights into Modern Political Reality. At this event, we will have the opportunity to hear the valuable contribution of two speakers of the topic. The conference will be broadcast on various digital platforms where the audience can link and ask questions that will then be posed to the speaker. First, we will have the participation of Dr. Francisco Fukuyama, director of the Fort Dorsey Master's Degree International Political at Stanford University in the United States. Professor Francisco Fukuyama received his bachelor's degree in classics from Cornell University and his doctorate from Harvard in political science. He was a member of the political science department at the RAND Corporation and policy planning staff at the United States Department of the State. Dr. Fukuyama has honorary doctorates from Connecticut College, Doan College, Doshisha University, Japan, Dansa University, Japan, Aarhus University, Denmark, and the partner runs the graduate school. He is a non-resident member on the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the CERN for Global Development. He is also a member of the board of the trustees of the RAND Corporation, the board and the governance of the party, the RAND Graduate School, and the Volker Alliance, and member of the American Political Science Association and the Council on Foreign Relations. In addition, we will have the participation of the renowned academic Martin Ueda-Zabaleta, director of the planning and the outreach sector in political science, our chair at the University of Buenos Aires, on an international level, whose collaboration for the dissemination of the interdisciplinary culture knows no bounds. He has given lecture alongside Nobel Peace Prize laureates such as Adolfo Pérez Esquivel and other relevant the figure of the contemporary intellectual thought. Currently, he is working or collaborate books with emeritus professor from prestigious universities such as Oxford, Harvard, Yale, California, Stanford, and MIT. I would like to highlight that Professor Francisco Fukuyama, we had 15 to 13 minutes to present his insightful contribution of the topic, and subsequently, Professor Martin Ueda-Zabaleta will have a similar amount of time to make his contribution or opinions on the topic. Estimate Professor Francisco Fukuyama, thank you very much for granting and such a high honor. I know you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to address an audience in Buenos Aires and in other places. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to reflect on The End of History, which was an article published first in the summer of 1989, and then my book, The End of History and the Last Man. I think the best place to start is to summarize my argument, because I think that a lot of people simply read the title and made a lot of assumptions about what my argument was. And I think it's important to establish some of the things that I said and didn't say. The end of history phrase comes from the great German philosopher Hegel, who argued that there had been progress in the development of human institutions over many centuries, and that history was directional, but that it was culminating in the kind of liberal regime that characterized Germany in his period. And obviously, when I used the phrase back in 1989, it didn't refer to the ending of events. It referred to the question of what we would today call modernization or development, desarrollo. And where does that process lead to? My argument was that it seemed to be leading not to communism, as many Marxists believed for many decades prior to that, but to some form of liberal democracy tied to a market economy, and that there were not other social systems that were obviously better or superior or more stable than that. Now, one comment that I get all the time today is, weren't you wrong about the direction of political development around the world? When I wrote The End of History originally, we were in the middle of what the political scientist Samuel Huntington labeled the third wave of democratization. There were only a handful of democracies in the early 1970s, but beginning with Spain and Portugal in the early 70s, you had an enormous number of transitions to democracy, including in Argentina and many other Latin American countries, a process that culminated with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the former Soviet Union in 1989, 1991. But today we're obviously living in a very different period. There's been a lot of backsliding in existing democracies. You've had the rise of two big authoritarian great powers, Russia and China. You've had the failure of many young democracies or problems with democracies in Myanmar, in Tunisia, in El Salvador, in Georgia, many other places. And then finally, you've had the rise of nationalist populism. It's a new kind of populism, this time of the right rather than of the left. And the foremost example of this is in the world's oldest democracy, the United States, with the rise of Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again movement. So I don't want to pretend that we are living in a positive era in terms of democratic development, but I think that it's important to understand that the real question I was trying to pose is, can we expect a further stage of history, like communism, that once held sway among many people on the left, that would be an alternative form of human social and political organization that was significantly different from liberal democracy? And there are obviously alternatives right now. I think the most plausible one is the Chinese system, which is produced a high level of economic growth and stability. What I would say, however, is that there are still reasons to believe that in the long run, a liberal democracy that depends on the support of its citizens, that divides power rather than concentrating it through checks and balances and a constitutional order underpinning the rule of law, in the long run is still going to be a more successful political system. But I think that we need at this point to acknowledge the challenges that exist to liberal democracy and why it is that in so many parts of the world, democracy is backsliding. I think that there are different critiques that are made by both the left and the right. If we begin with a critique on the left, the argument that is made, especially by younger activists, is that liberal democracy has failed to deliver on the kind of equality and social justice that it claims to be based on. Liberal democracy recognizes the equality of all people as human beings. It does not put one group of people above another. And it argues that a rule of law is applied evenly to, everybody that is a citizen. And this is obviously something that has never been fully achieved in the United States, in Europe, in any existing liberal democracy. And for that reason, you have a lot of people on the left that would argue that, in fact, liberal democracy is dominated by large corporations, by concentrations of capital, by oligarchs in many countries that hold the real power in those societies, despite having elections and the appearance of popular participation. That's one criticism. I think that what we've seen is actually a period of so-called neoliberalism. Now, in Latin America, neoliberalism sometimes is a synonym for just capitalism. The sense I'm using it is a little bit different. It refers to the kinds of very liberal economic policies associated with the University of Chicago, with Milton Friedman and economists of that type, who are very reliant on markets to solve social problems. And I think that that was a set of policies that was tried between the late 70s and the early 21st century. It actually produced a great deal of economic growth. You couldn't have had the rise of China or India without these kinds of neoliberal policies. But in many respects, it went too far. It produced a great deal of instability that hit many countries in terms of currency crisis, beginning with Britain in the early 1990s, the Asian financial crisis, the crisis in Argentina, crisis in Russia, and it culminated in the big subprime crisis in the United States in 2008. Now, in my view, this did not reflect a problem with capitalism or the market economy per se. This was a problem of the deregulation and the downplaying of state power that had been characteristic of this neoliberal period. And as we speak, the pendulum is already shifting back towards greater state regulation and greater state involvement in promoting economic growth. And so I think that that was not a problem intrinsic to liberal democracy. It was rather, or not a problem intrinsic to liberal market economics, but rather to a particular interpretation of it. The problem on the right is different. In a liberal democracy, we regard all citizens as having equal rights, and those rights reflect an equal respect and recognition of their shared humanity that takes place under law. So the left-wing critique would say that not everybody is actually treated equally. The right-wing critique would say it's actually that equal treatment that is the problem, that human beings want to have a sense of community. They want to have a sense of community, sometimes based on ethnicity, sometimes based on religion, sometimes based on a shared culture, and that a liberal society, because it tolerates many different diverse ways of life, does not create this shared sense of community that people really strive for. And that's the reason that many of the challenges to liberal democracy today in places like Hungary or India or Turkey are coming from conservatives that would say that the nation or a single religious framework is more important. You see that particularly in India, where a liberal India that was created in the 1940s by Nehru and Gandhi is being displaced by an India that is based on Hindu nationalism under the BJP and Prime Minister Modi. And a Hindu nationalist would argue that people living in India ought to enjoy the ability to practice their shared religion uh, uh, in the public sphere, which is something that liberals would not necessarily accept. Now, I believe that there's a big problem with this because not everybody in India is Hindu. I think it's hard to govern a place like that without being a liberal regime, but it does represent an aspiration of many people in India for a much stronger sense of community than is possible. And I think that this speaks to probably one of the biggest themes in nearly all of my books, beginning with the end of history, but concluding with the more recent books I've written on identity and liberalism, which is that human beings actually have a third part of the human personality that does not seek material benefit. If you look at the model of human behavior that is used by economists, they say that human beings are rational utility maximizers, meaning that they're basically selfish individuals that want to maximize their incomes, and they are intelligent, and so they go about it in, in very complex ways. And I think that it misses an important part of the human personality that Plato in the Republic labeled thumos. Thumos is a Greek word. In English, it's sometimes translated as spiritedness or pride or anger, but it's the part of the human personality that desires recognition, basically recognition of one's status. And in a liberal democracy, everybody has the same, excuse me, the same degree of recognition as a human being. And I think that one of the problems in liberal democracy is that this kind of universal recognition is simply not enough for a lot of people, that they want to be parts of more tightly bonded communities based on a shared religion, shared ethnicity, shared culture. And this is what's propelling a lot of the populist opposition to liberal democracy around the world. The other issue that is oftentimes raised is whether there aren't big problems that really can't be solved by liberal democracy and by the rule of law on which liberal democracy is grounded. One of the arguments that's been made is that climate change is producing a global crisis that requires either a transnational source of authority, because you need cooperation between different societies on a scale that we have not been able to achieve up till now. But there'd also be an argument that it requires strong and decisive action. And liberal democracy, with its rule of law, with its procedural constraints on the exercise of power, cannot make decisions fast enough and decisively enough to really deal with this kind of crisis. It's not simply climate change that requires strong action. I think that many countries in Latin America, for example, have been plagued by narco trafficking, gangs, criminal activity. And you see a direct challenge to liberal democracy in a country like El Salvador, where President Bukele has come to power, basically arrested a very large part of the male youth population without due process, outside of a real rule of law, and has been successful in bringing down the crime rate. And I think for that reason, is going to have many imitators throughout the region. And I think people would say there are times when you just need stronger government, stronger than what liberal democracy can provide. So those are, I think, some of the discontents that are going on with democracy right now. My belief is that there are also big defects in the way that authoritarian governments make decisions. Russia and China, for example, have concentrated power, all political power, in one individual. Vladimir Putin in the case of Russia, and Xi Jinping in the case of China. And, you know, this allows them to make bigger mistakes than would be possible in a true liberal democracy. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a historic mistake that has gravely weakened Russia over the long run. And it could only be made in a Russia that really only had one leader at the top who had any authority to make decisions like that. Similarly, the zero COVID policy of Xi Jinping was something that could only be the product of the concentration of authority in that country under a single individual who seems to be nostalgic actually for some form of communism, because he's putting a lot of constraints on the ability of the Chinese private sector to actually be innovative, to promote economic growth, and to do the sorts of things that have turned China into this incredible success story. Now, I guess I should end talking a little bit about the United States. The United States has been the pillar of a liberal world order since 1945 as the richest and most powerful democracy in the world. It was responsible for organizing initially the UN system, for the World Trade Organization, for a series of security alliances in Europe and in Asia that have been quite remarkably successful over many decades in providing stability and economic growth for a lot of the world. But at the moment, American power has been very much weakened by the internal polarization. This kind of polarization is familiar in a lot of countries around the world, but it's taken on a very extreme form of in the United States recently. We saw this in the failure of the US Congress to support Ukraine, for example, for several months this past winter. And Americans seem to be very divided on really basic issues about their own electoral system, about the legitimacy of democracy itself. And I think it's going to be subject to considerable risk in the election that we have upcoming that might return Donald Trump to the presidency. And so I think in the end, there are no guarantees about the survival of democracy itself. One of the mistakes I think that people have made in reading my own book is to think that I have a kind of Marxist understanding of history, in which history is this mechanism that simply moves in one direction regardless of human will or regardless of human agency. That was never my argument. You know, democracy does not grow and survive if people don't fight for democracy. And I think that at the present moment, we face a lot of challenges in terms of the survival of democracy in many countries. And unless people are mobilized and unless people have a continuing confidence that democracy can actually solve their problems as a people, as a society, democracy is not going to survive. I think it will, but it's still an open question. And I don't think my book was ever intended to be a kind of futurology that would, predict a determinate outcome in the future. Maybe I'll close by saying that, in many respects, Latin America as a whole is not doing as badly as some other parts of the world, because democracy does seem to be fairly deeply rooted there. Latin America has got a lot of other problems with its own form of polarization, with corruption, with narco trafficking, with a lot of forces that have weakened the ability of democratic governments in Latin America to actually deliver the outcomes that their people want. But I do think that in the end, in certain respects, belief in democracy does remain rooted, and the big problems, I think, really are more in policy than in faith in fundamental institutions. You may tell me that I'm wrong about that, but that's been my observation as someone that has visited Latin America quite frequently in the past. So with that, maybe I will conclude, and I look forward to Professor Ueda's comments, and then I take it we'll open this up for a more open discussion.
Thank you very much, esteemed Professor Francisco Fukuyama, for your brilliant exposition that illuminates this academic panorama impressively. Now this Professor Martin Ueda turn to present.
Okay.
Esteemed Professor Martin Ueda, thank you very much for the granting at such a high honor. And now you have the floor, please.
Yes. Thank you, Luis. Professor Fukuyama, it is an honor to be able to share this platform with you in the realm of promotion democratic values on a global scale and within a context of constant change in the world order. Currently, the world faces a series of threats that could undermine the hegemony of these values. On one hand, there is the crisis addressing liberal value system and the problems of meeting expectation, and on the other hand, the explosion of poles that may present a model contrary to liberal democracy. We can affirm that there are autocratic temptations on the part of these new populists, which high rise alarm among several defenders of democratic institutions and democratic liberalism. This pessimism may be based on comparisons made between recent years using indicators such as that from Freedom House or The Economist, but they are often the arbitrariness. There were historical much more negative moments, for example, 1930 or during the Cold War period. Several of the authoritarian groupings may be more of an effect of something that has been happening long before in the United States. The process of political polarization between Republicans and Democrats has been gradual. The same can be observed in several European countries. Let's say is a reaction stemming from a discontent of structural flaws that have not been able to be solved exclusively with identity-political discourse or a failure to meet the expectation of liberal governments. We cannot consider it determinants that this not traits collapse the democratic system. The institutional strengths of those countries does not facilitate a rest with their liberal tradition, but rather allows them to maintain resilience and constant weighing among the various actors that intervene in them. The main trait of those new populists resolve around certain attitudes or institutional transgressions that previously would have been unthinkable, such as the denial of electoral transparency, hostility towards certain specific groups or leaders expressing citing sexism. They are usually represented by far-right parties or alternative right, thus present nuances such as sympathies with fascist ideology. What is a constant is the strong component of ultranationalism that relates the certain trends or prioritizing security or what they understand as their way of life. However, solid democracies can have the capacity to ally or counterbalance politicians. Let us see the recent Italian experience. No? The new president who was even called Mussolini's heir, but during European agendas should first support for NATO, condemn Putin, and also the mainstream of certain firmness with the migration agenda, but she does not have the necessary faculties to comply with a programmatic line. With few sections, very few, several leaders with authoritarian tendencies have now incurred problems that threaten the existence of liberal democracies governing Western countries. Now, the main problems on trade lies in those countries that do not have solid democratic institutions, especially those that fall within the so-called peripheral or younger democracy. For reason of time, I will highlight the experience of Latin America, like Western countries with solid democracies, disruptive phenomena have been affecting democracies, but these are not precisely based on 21st century socialism. To a certain extent, this has failing to meet the necessary expectation. Many structural problems remains in force, and the Venezuela experience has not been the most favorable. Similarly, disillusionment with neoliberalism is constant in this region. Sorry. At the same time, polarization has been increasing the evidence of degradation of democratic liberalism. Populist proposals are emerging, which now tend to be right-wing and identity-based liberalism, regarding which of the two use currently the main threat well right-wing populists. For a simple reason, left-wing woke progressives has not resonated within the popular sector of the population. Political correct culture remains alien to large part of the population. Amon shows with a colleague we use the say that every time feminists supported a certain political candidate, he lost. There is some truth based on the values that can be seen very well in the World Values Survey, in which traditionalism and conventionality are strong, except for some academic sector, elites, who have direct contact with European or North American countries. And therefore, progress in Western values, most of the population is apathetic and reluctant to adhere to these progressive and identity principles. The strongest identity discourse that has taken place is indigenous over the past 20 years, especially Latin America progressive has been promoting and empowering the identity of indigenous people, which are numerous in various regions of Latin America. And yet a large part of this population prioritizes security over post-material elements. What is curious is that the deviation from liberalism that you mentioned has been promoted institutions from Western countries seeking this type of diffusion of left-wing liberal principles, but it has generated a strong reaction from conservative population. Postmodern approaches and post-material values are not a priority within their ideology. This reaction is functional to this incipient alternative right that has been brewing in recent years, which really takes some populist leaders of Western countries as referent politics. For example, the issue of electoral frauds is increasingly becoming a slogan in several presidential elections, which can be very dangerous and can lead to that attempt to replicate the taking of capital in Brasilia almost 2 years ago, based on Manichaean logic, where they assume the sense as revolutionary subjects. It is a very peculiar phenomenon that has been studied from this new alternative right. This is characterized by radical interpretation agents in opposition, creating a series of internal enemies, which means left-wing liberal and orthodox Marxists, which they call part of their culture war. There is hostility towards any identity group or science seeking to maintain a certain degree of institutionalism and respect for basic freedoms. Likewise, these new populist ways in itself empowered many parties with authoritarian tendencies and even reclaiming governments from period of dictatorship. These parties that maintain a certain degree of discrepancy, polarized radical, or new actors have emerged who faced with any threats to their values apply the theory of the internal enemy against their opposition, even polarizing with moderate sectors that don't adhere to their political value codes. The main change lands in that initially traditional conservative parties tried to sell the sense as certain guarantors of the principle that were from the status quo. They didn't consider the sense is anti-system, much less as great transformers, but now in function of the influence with these new alternative rights that have been renewed and managed this quick where the high put progressive are synonymous with the status quo, and that being ultra-conservative is revolutionary, despite the fact the really Latin America just not being woke and they are falling into retrograde position.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, esteemed Professor Martin Ueda, for your brilliant opinion today in this conference. I appreciate greatly for your contribution for book or you. I would like to mention that we received question for book due to time constraints. We had select two. Here they are. How do you perceive the role of emergent technology such as artificial intelligence and biotechnology in shaping the future of political system worldwide? In addition, how do you believe this invasion could influence the applicability of democratic principles in governance? Professor Francisco Fukuyama will have 5 minutes to respond to the first question, followed by Martin Ueda, Professor Martin Ueda, to address the second question similarly. Professor Francisco Fukuyama, you have the floor. We deeply appreciate this honor.
So the question of technology, I think, has been very important to the problems that democracies have been experiencing. When the internet was first privatized and became a widespread tool for ordinary people in the 1990s, we all thought that it would be very good for democracy because information is power, and now a lot of people were going to have access to information. They could mobilize, they could oppose authoritarian governments and the like. But things have turned out very differently, unfortunately. I think many authoritarian governments figured out how to control the internet. So China, for example, has a great firewall. Its citizens are not freely able to access information except the kind of information that their government wants them to see. And the internet has also been weaponized by both Russia and China, and also by right-wing extremist groups in the United States. You know, on the internet, we thought it was great because anyone could say anything they wanted, but it turns out that that includes a lot of misinformation, hate speech, bad quality material that people do not seem to be able to distinguish from sources of information that are credible. And I think a lot of the polarization that we see in the United States is due to the fact that people are getting completely different information about basic reality. So for example, something like 2/3 of Republicans in the United States believe that Joe Biden stole the 2020 election. There's really no credible evidence that this is true, and yet a majority of Republicans believe that that's the case. It's not because they've turned against democracy necessarily, but they believe essentially a lie, which is that there was a lot of Democratic manipulation of votes in many states, and that Trump actually got a much higher percentage of the vote than he was credited with. This is not true, but because of the internet, many people can believe that. You know, a large number of Republicans now believe that COVID vaccines are more harmful than they are helpful. And they can believe this because there's an internet media ecology that promotes this kind of conspiracy theory. And so, you know, that's one of the reasons I think that people are now living in their own information universes. And from that, they create very, very different kinds of political realities. And I think that with artificial intelligence, with deep fakes, with a lot of the new technologies that are just hitting the market, this problem is going to get worse. You may not believe a deep fake video of a politician saying something that he or she never said, but even if you don't believe it, what I think it does is to decrease the credibility of everything that you see on the internet, so that you become very cynical, and you know, you don't really know what's true and what's not, and therefore you're willing to believe anything. Now, in terms of biotechnology, I think we've already seen both the good and bad sides of it in the COVID epidemic. I think that there is still a good chance that the entire COVID epidemic was the result of a lab experiment that went wrong in China, and it shows some of the negative power of this kind of technology. I wrote a book in 2001 called Our Post-Human Future, in which I talked about genetic engineering as potentially being a way by which you could control the behavior of other people. Now, it's turned out that this threat hasn't really arrived yet, but I do think that in the future, it is something that we are going to have to worry about considerably, because there are a lot of mechanisms for controlling behavior, not just on a genetic level, but through drugs, through psychotropic interventions of various sorts. So those, I think, are the main consequences I see of these new technologies.
Okay.
That's right. Mhm. Perfect, perfect. Now, Professor Martin Ueda, you have the floor. We deeply appreciate this honor today.
Okay. Technology can facilitate organization and optimal control for governments and corporations. In any political system, affecting regulation and moderation of these tools by the government are crucial to upholding the rule of law. Bureaucracy through technology could also help bridge material gap among citizens. Almost ultimately in changing quality of life. Why technology enhance management efficiency, it may exacerbate economic and social disparities. Without robots capacity building initiatives, many citizens may find the decibel displayed by automation. And moreover, technology can potentially involve the political system to extend their reach, leading to heightened geopolitical tensions, easing increasing multipolar world. Additionally, the gap between developed and peripheral countries may widen further, resulting in sustained stagnation of median incomes as automation increases the allure of labor diminishes, posing challenges to developing productive capacities. Moreover, emerging democracies may find themselves most susceptible to global influences, potential compromising their ability to foster succinct engagement with democratic institutions as they lag behind in competing with technology advanced nations. Income stagnation among their populations becomes a pressing concern. Furthermore, amidst a backdrop of growing discontent, there is a risk that radical narrative questioning liberal democracies may gain traction among disillusioned citizens, depending on the success of non-liberal political systems elsewhere. They could serve as model for certain leaders seeking to emulate or align with alternative governance structures. For example, China, Russia, and others.
Thank you very much for your wonderful opinion and this respect. We want to express our sincere gratitude to both of you for your contribution. Due to time constraints, unfortunately, we must conclude this academic event to date. We will serve to deepen this reflection and contribute to building a more conscious society, aiming to contract a much better world. We would like to extend our thanks to Professor Francisco Fukuyama for his tremendous willingness and volition to accompany us, as well as for granting us this esteemed honor. From here, we express our fervent desire to be able to visit you personally someday at Stanford University to greet you in person and continue conserving and dialoguing with you and other colleagues on the captivating topics, with the aim of building a better world and continuing to work plan new collaborate projects. Would you agree, dear friend and esteemed colleague Francisco Fukuyama?
Yes, sure. Anytime you want to visit Stanford, you're welcome to do so. And I hope that we can stay in touch and collaborate in the future.
Thank you very much, Ivan. We wish you many congratulations. Thank you very much. That's
okay,
right.
Thank you. Very good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
¿Qué tal salió bien?